The heavy wooden oak doors of the grand hall shattered open against the ancient stone walls. Nova stumbled into the brilliant morning sunlight of the royal courtyard. The eerie silver luminescence of her cursed sight was just fading from her wide eyes, leaving her dizzy and violently trembling. The phantom agony of a poisoned blade still burned deep within her chest, echoing a violent death that had not yet come to pass. She collapsed heavily onto the pristine marble steps, right before the magnificent northern procession. Which country are you listening from? Please comment down below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Nova clawed her way to her knees, ignoring the sharp sting of the cold marble. She cried out for Alpha King Kieran, his name tearing from her throat as she begged him to listen. She warned him the northern canyon was a devastating trap, but Kieran only looked down at her with eyes as cold as winter ice. His powerful alpha voice boomed over the silent crowd, declaring her a delusional madwoman and a disgrace to their kind. He called her painful visions, pathetic lies, and publicly severed their sacred mate bond. With a careless flick of his royal wrist, he ordered her banished to the desolate borderlands immediately. As heavy armored hands dragged her away, Nova simply stopped fighting them. She stared back at the arrogant king, knowing with absolute certainty that in exactly 3 short days he was going to die alone. The wind howled across the jagged peaks of the northern borderlands, carrying the bitter chill of early winter. Nova wrapped her threadbare cloak tighter around her frail shoulders, her numb fingers struggling to secure the frayed edges. This was the edge of the world, a desolate wasteland where discarded souls were sent to simply fade away. She stood in the doorway of a crumbling stone cabin abandoned decades ago by hunters long dead. The roof was partially caved in, and the hearth was nothing more than a blackened scar against the cracked wall. Yet she had spent the last 3 days transforming this ruin into a sanctuary of quiet dignity. She refused to break. Kieran had shattered her heart and stripped away her title, but he could not take her resilience. She stepped out into the frost-bitten morning, gathering deadwood from the frozen earth. Every breath she took plumed like white smoke in the frigid air. Her hands were blistered from clearing the debris, but she welcomed the physical ache. It was a grounding pain far better than the terrifying phantom agonies of her visions. For her entire life, she had been treated as a fragile glass doll cursed with a madness she could not control. Her pack had whispered behind her back, casting fearful glances whenever the silver light touched her eyes. They called her invisible, weak, and ultimately a traitor. She dragged a heavy fallen branch back toward her makeshift home, her thoughts drifting to the magnificent golden gates she had left behind. She remembered the vibrant colors of the market and the deep resonance of the pack bond that used to connect them all. Now there was only silence. The severed mate bond inside her chest felt like a raw, gaping wound. Kieran was supposed to be her other half, destined to protect her and understand her heavy burden. Instead, he had chosen pride over truth and cruelty over compassion. He had looked at her desperate tears and seen only a threat to his power. A lone tear escaped her eye, freezing in the biting wind. She brushed it away, instantly lifting her chin. She would not cry for a king who chose his own doom. Back inside the dim cabin, Nova knelt before the hearth, striking 2 rough stones together. Sparks flew, catching onto the dry moss. A tiny fragile flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows against the cold stone walls. She fed the fire slowly, nursing it until it grew warm. Sitting back on her heels, she stared into the flames, finding a strange sort of peace in the isolation. Here in the frozen wasteland, there was no one to judge her. There was no one to fear the silver light in her eyes. She did not have to hide her true self behind a mask of quiet obedience. She could just breathe without the suffocating weight of royal expectations pressing down upon her shoulders. But the newfound peace was a fragile illusion. The heavy burden of her hidden gift never truly slept, it merely waited in the dark corners of her mind. She pulled a hardened piece of bread from her pocket, breaking off a tiny corner and eating it slowly to savor the meager sustenance. Her mind kept drifting relentlessly back to the bloody northern canyon. The dark shadows she had seen were far too real, the metallic scent of poisoned silver too pungent to ignore. She knew the cruel mechanics of her ancient curse intimately. 3 short days. She always saw the looming threads of terrible fate exactly 3 days before they snapped violently into harsh reality. Today was the 3rd day since she stood on those marble steps. Nova closed her weary eyes, leaning her head against the rough stone wall, trying desperately to block out the rising panic. She told herself over and over that it was no longer her problem. She had warned them all. She had sacrificed her dignity and her rightful place to speak the truth, and they had thrown her to the wolves. The kingdom's fate rested entirely on the broad shoulders of an arrogant king who stubbornly refused to listen. Yet the inherent goodness within her soul could not turn a blind eye away from impending death. She suddenly felt the sharp, violent shift in the atmosphere, a heavy magical weight pressing down upon her chest. The howling wind outside seemed to suddenly die away, leaving an unnatural, suffocating silence. Her heart began to pound a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She recognized this terrifying feeling. It was the immense pressure that always preceded a violent temporal tear, the physical manifestation of fate crashing into the present moment. Nova scrambled to her feet, her breath catching painfully in her dry throat. The warm fire in the stone hearth abruptly flared, turning a brilliant, unnatural shade of blinding silver. The long, dark shadows in the tiny room twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled falling, bleeding men and rearing, screaming horses. A sharp, sickening, agonizing pain ripped through her right shoulder, mirroring the exact trajectory of a poisoned blade, striking royal flesh miles away. She stumbled, clutching her shoulder, as the ethereal silver light flooded her vision completely. The 3rd bright sun had finally reached its ultimate zenith, and the arrogant king's borrowed mortal time had just violently run out. The agonizing surge of magic threw Nova violently against the rough stone floor of her ruined cabin. Her entire body convulsed as the absolute certainty of the king's fate crashed over her frail form. This was the true cruelty of the sight of the looming thread. It was not merely a fleeting glimpse into the distant future. It was a complete and overwhelming sensory immersion that violently hijacked her mind and body. The silver light that poured from her eyes was so blindingly bright it illuminated the dark corners of the desolate room. For 3 agonizing minutes, she was entirely trapped within the bloody canyon miles away. She felt the heavy dampness of the evening fog clinging to her skin. She smelled the sharp metallic tang of poison blades cutting through the cold night air. She heard the frantic screams of dying men and the terrified whinnies of armored warhorses trapped in a deadly ambush. Most devastating of all, she felt the sudden phantom sting of a jagged sword piercing her own right shoulder, perfectly mirroring the brutal injury meant for her fated mate. When the terrifying vision finally released its iron grip on her mind, Nova gasped for air, as if she had been drowning in an icy river. She curled into a tight, shivering ball on the hard dirt floor, coughing weakly. Cold sweat drenched her threadbare clothes, and every muscle in her body ached with a profound, exhausting weariness. The ethereal silver glow slowly faded from her wide irises, leaving behind a dull, throbbing headache that threatened to split her skull in two. This was the heavy price of her hidden magic. She was a living vessel for the heavy currents of time and fate, but her fragile mortal body was never meant to channel such immense, relentless power. Each vivid premonition chipped away at her core vitality, leaving her physically battered and emotionally drained. She slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position, wrapping her arms tightly around her trembling knees. She knew it was done. The 3 allotted days had passed, and the fatal moment had arrived just as she had desperately warned him it would. A heavy, hollow silence filled the tiny cabin, pressing down on her tired shoulders. She wondered if Kieran had thought of her in his final violent moments. She wondered if the arrogant king finally realized that the broken Omega he had so cruelly banished was the only person who had tried to save his life. But there was no time for grief in her desolate world. There was never any time for true peace. Her curse demanded constant, unyielding vigilance. Even as she sat shivering in the dim, gentle light of the dying fire, a familiar, sickening pressure began to build behind her eyes once again. It was a new fate thread pulling tightly against her consciousness, demanding to be witnessed. Nova squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her bruised palms against her aching temples, praying for a single moment of quiet. She begged the ancient magic to leave her alone, to let her rest in her lonely exile. But the powerful magic did not care for her deep exhaustion. The pressure intensified until it felt as though the very air in the cabin had turned to solid stone, crushing her chest. Her eyes snapped open against her will, and the blinding silver luminescence returned with a terrifying sudden vengeance. This time she was not pulled away to a distant bloody battlefield. This new vision was entirely localized, anchoring her firmly to the desolate borderlands. The tiny warm flames in the hearth vanished, replaced by the horrifying image of absolute whiteout conditions. She felt the ambient temperature plummet, so rapidly her breath crystallized instantly in her throat. The deafening roar of an unnatural winter hurricane filled her sensitive ears, drowning out all other earthly sound. She saw the heavy wooden beams of her fragile sanctuary violently splintering under the immense crushing weight of relentless snow and solid ice. The phantom cold seeped deep into her aching bones, freezing her blood and completely numbing her pale extremities. She watched helplessly as the very stone walls that sheltered her collapsed inward, threatening to bury her alive in a frozen, inescapable tomb. The intense vision lasted only a few terrifying moments before the heavy thread snapped securely into place, locking the grim future into inevitable reality. The silver light slowly receded, leaving Nova violently gasping for warm air in the quiet, ruined cabin. She stared blankly at the still intact wooden beams above her head, her heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. 3 days. She had exactly 3 short days before the most devastating winter storm of the century would completely obliterate the northern borderland. Her hidden gift was a relentless, cruel master, always pushing her toward the very next disaster. She slowly climbed to her unsteady feet, her mind racing with desperate survival plan. She needed to reinforce the crumbling walls and gather every piece of dry wood she could possibly find. She had to prepare for the freezing wrath of nature alone. But as she moved toward the heavy wooden door to inspect the exterior structural damage, a strained, lingering detail from the freezing vision suddenly crystallized perfectly in her mind. Through the blinding snow and falling timber, she had seen a massive dark shape emerging from the deadly whiteout. It was not a wild, starving beast seeking warm shelter. It was a heavily armored royal carriage bearing the distinct golden crest of the Alpha King tearing through the deadly storm directly toward her hidden wooden door. The heavy revelation of the armored carriage haunted Nova as she frantically worked to fortify the crumbling cabin. She dragged heavy logs and stacked them against the weakest walls, desperate to create a barrier against the impending winter wrath. Her small hands bled and her muscles screamed in protest, but the physical labor was a welcome distraction from the heavy memories threatening to pull her under. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the golden royal crest pushing through the blinding snow. Why would King Kieran come here? The question gnawed at her very soul. He had banished her with such cold finality, casting her out into the frozen wasteland to die a slow, invisible death. The thought of his return stirred a deep, dormant terror within her chest, a fear that was planted long before she ever met the arrogant king. As she wedged a thick wooden plank against the rotting door frame, her mind violently slipped backward, slipping away into the dark shadows of her painful childhood. She was only 7 years old when the silver light first claimed her innocent eyes. She remembered the stifling heat of that terrible summer evening and the overwhelming scent of burning pine that flooded her small bedroom exactly 3 days before the great southern forest fire. Little Nova had run crying to the village elders, desperately tugging at their heavy robes, begging them to move the eastern hunting party away from the dry ridge. The elders had simply laughed at the frightened child, dismissing her frantic tears as a silly nightmare. 3 days later, the sky turned black with choking smoke, and the hunting party never returned home. But instead of realizing she had tried to save them, the grieving pack turned their absolute fury upon the small girl with the glowing silver eyes. They did not see a gifted seer trying to help her people. They only saw a dark witch, a cursed child who had summoned the destructive flames with her wicked, unnatural word. The painful memory of being dragged into the dark isolation cellar still made her adult lungs burn with phantom smoke. She was locked away in the pitch-black cold for weeks, punished severely for daring to speak the devastating truth. The harsh lesson was beaten into her fragile bones. To speak was to suffer. To warn was to invite endless agony and cruel blame. Her powerful voice was not a gift, it was a dangerous weapon that only ever wounded her. For years she had forced herself to swallow the terrifying visions, letting the silver light burn her from the inside out, rather than face the brutal wrath of her ignorant past. She became the quiet, obedient Omega, fading into the invisible background, terrified of her own shadow. Breaking that long silence for King Kieran had taken every ounce of her gathered courage. She had risked everything, defying a lifetime of deep trauma, because her soul recognized him as her fated mate. And he had rewarded her ultimate sacrifice with the exact same cruelty the elders had shown her so many years ago. Nova snapped back to the freezing present, dropping the heavy wooden plank to the dirt floor. She sank to her knees, wiping the cold sweat from her brow. She was completely done trying to save people who blindly refused to see the truth. She would survive this impending winter storm alone, and she would never let the cruel world use her gift against her ever again. She slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from her trembling knees, and walked toward the small broken window looking out over the endlessly desolate frozen wasteland. The harsh biting wind had finally died down, leaving behind an eerie suffocating stillness that made her skin crawl. The late afternoon sky was rapidly changing, shedding the pale blue of daylight for something far more sinister. The fading sun dipped low heavily, staining the jagged horizon in deep violent shades of bruised purple and dark crimson red. It looked exactly like freshly spilled blood soaking into the cold, barren earth. A sudden, sharp, agonizing jolt of pure energy suddenly ripped through the quiet atmosphere, sending a violent shiver straight down her spine. Nova gripped the cold stone windowsill, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The heavy magical tether connecting her to the king violently vibrated deep within her chest. She knew exactly what that terrifying shift meant. The third sun was finally setting over the distant northern canyon. The dark shadows were slowly lengthening across the treacherous northern canyon, and the deadly poison blades were finally being drawn from their cold, dark sheath. The exact fatal hour of the arrogant king's bloody ambush had finally arrived, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it now. The heavy hooves of the royal cavalry echoed like distant thunder against the sheer stone walls of the northern canyon. Alpha King Kieran rode at the vanguard, his golden armor catching the final dying rays of the third sun. The air was growing thick and uncomfortably cold as evening shadows stretched long and dark across the narrow path. A strange, suffocating silence had fallen over the usually boisterous ranks of his elite guard. Kieran shifted uncomfortably in his heavy leather saddle, his broad shoulders tight with an unexplainable tension. He told himself it was simply the natural fatigue of a long campaign, but deep within his chest a dull, hollow ache refused to fade. It was the severed edge of his mate bond, a constant, agonizing reminder of the fragile Omega he had banished exactly 3 days ago. He tried to push the pathetic image of Nova from his proud mind. He recalled her wild silver eyes and her frantic, desperate tears upon the marble steps. She had screamed about this very canyon, warning of dark shadows and poisoned blades. He had mocked her, calling her a broken madwoman entirely unfit for his royal court. He was the greatest warrior king their history had ever seen, and he firmly believed he did not need to cower at the delusional nightmares of a weak girl. Yet as the heavy evening fog began to roll down from the jagged peaks above, a strange, ominous scent drifted into the valley. It was the sharp, pungent metallic tang of treated silver mixing with the damp earth. Kieran pulled hard on the heavy leather reins, bringing his massive warhorse to a sudden halt. The entire royal procession stopped behind him, the sudden silence deafening in the narrow gorge. He narrowed his golden eyes, peering into the thick, swirling mist ahead. The temperature plummeted rapidly, biting through his heavy woolen cloak. His highly trained alpha senses flared to life, catching the faint sound of shifting loose gravel on the high ridges above them. Nova's frantic warning echoed violently in his mind. The dark shadow where the faceless assassin waited. He had ignored her absolute truth, blinded by his own towering arrogance and his relentless desire for a flawless logical reign. He had demanded a strong warrior queen and foolishly discarded a true gifted seer. Before he could even open his mouth to bark a command to his loyal vanguard, the quiet evening shattered. A blinding flash of silver cut through the heavy gray fog, tearing the peaceful silence to absolute shred. High above them, hidden figures emerged from the shadows, unleashing a devastating volley of heavy iron bolts. Chaos erupted instantly within the narrow canyon walls. The terrified warhorses reared up, screaming in panic as the deadly rain fell upon the royal convoy. Kieran drew his massive broadsword, the heavy steel singing as it cleared the leather sheath. He roared a fierce battle cry, desperately trying to rally his surprised soldiers, but the ambush was flawlessly executed, just as the cursed vision had foretold. Thick black smoke suddenly billowed from the canyon floor, obscuring his vision and choking his lungs. The assassins descended from the rocky cliffs like dark wraiths, moving with terrifying speed and lethal precision. They wore no colors and carried no banners, only cold steel coated in the deadly shimmering poison that burned through werewolf flesh like acid. Kieran fought with the furious strength of a desperate king, his heavy blade meeting their rapid strikes with bone-shattering force. But they were far too many, and his elite guard was hopelessly trapped in the narrow bottleneck. He watched in absolute horror as his bravest warriors fell around him, their innocent blood staining the dry earth, just as the banished Omega had solemnly promised. Every desperate parry and every frantic strike forced him to swallow the bitter ash of his own foolish pride. He had marched his finest men directly into a flawless slaughter simply because he was too arrogant to listen to the only woman who possessed the courage to speak the truth. The heavy smoke burned his eyes, but the agonizing realization burned much deeper in his soul. The fated mate he had cruelly cast into the frozen wastelands was not a delusional liar. She was a profound miracle sent by the goddess, and he had thrown her away like garbage. A sudden terrifying shift in the wind cleared the heavy smoke directly to his right, revealing a massive cloaked figure leaping silently from a low rocky outcropping. The faceless assassin moved with unnatural blinding speed, completely bypassing the chaotic melee and locking his deadly focus entirely on the Alpha King. Kieran tried to pivot his heavy warhorse, but the exhausted beast stumbled on the uneven rocks, throwing the king completely off balance. Time seemed to slow to a torturous crawl as Kieran stared down the long length of the assassin's blade. The jagged steel was coated in a glowing dark substance, the unmistakable sickly gleam of pure wolfsbane laced with liquid silver. It was a fatal strike meticulously designed to pierce royal armor and stop a powerful alpha heart instantly. Kieran raised his broadsword in a desperate, clumsy attempt to block the incoming blow, but his arms felt terribly heavy and slow, trapped in the inevitable current of a fate he could not escape. The assassin lunged forward, the poisoned tip aiming flawlessly for the small, vulnerable gap beneath Kieran's golden chest plate. In that terrifying final fraction of a second, Kieran did not think of his glorious crown or his vast, wealthy kingdom. His mind flashed completely to the beautiful, haunting silver glow of Nova's innocent eyes and the devastating realization that his final breath would be spent knowing he had utterly destroyed the only soul meant to complete him. The poisoned blade closed the final distance, the deadly tip tearing through his outer tunic and rushing directly toward his beating heart. The poisoned steel plunged downward, carrying the inescapable weight of absolute death. King Kieran braced for the cold, agonizing end, knowing deep in his shattered soul that he entirely deserved this violent fate. He had chosen blind pride over his fated mate, and now his entire kingdom would pay the ultimate heavy price for his towering arrogance. But just as the deadly glowing tip of the blade brushed against the golden fabric of his royal tunic, a massive sudden force violently slammed into his left side. It was not the cold embrace of the goddess taking him down to the dark underworld. It was the desperate heavy weight of a loyal young guard, throwing his entire armored body against the massive king. The violent sudden impact sent them both crashing hard into the unforgiving rocky ground in a chaotic tangle of heavy steel and bruised limbs. The deadly poison blade missed Kieran's racing heart, by a mere fraction of an inch, slicing cleanly through the thick leather of his shoulder guard instead. A sharp burning agony flared instantly in his right shoulder, perfectly mirroring the exact intents. Phantom pain Nova had suffered alone miles away in the frozen wasteland. The faceless assassin stumbled forward, thrown entirely off balance by the sudden, unexpected interference. Before the dark, silent figure could recover his footing and strike again, the young brave guard scrambled fiercely to his feet, raising his heavy iron shield and driving his broadsword directly into the dark assassin's chest. The dark attacker let out a wet, ragged gasp and collapsed backward into the swirling gray fog, dead before he even hit the hard, rocky earth. Kieran lay heavily on the damp ground, his broad chest heaving frantically as he desperately gasped for the cold canyon air. The burning pain in his right shoulder was incredibly intense, a wicked throbbing ache that radiated deep into his dense bones, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the violent shock currently shaking his very core. He was still alive. He had somehow survived the flawless, lethal ambush. He slowly pushed his heavy body up onto his good elbow, staring in absolute pure horror at the heavy, poisoned blade that was now deeply embedded in the solid canyon stone, exactly where his chest had been only a split second before. The dark, sickly poison hissed and bubbled violently against the gray rock, eating away the hard surface with a terrifying, corrosive speed that made his stomach violently churn. If that deadly blade had struck true, he would already be a lifeless, rotting corpse bleeding out in the dirt. The canyon all around them remained a chaotic, violent blur of clashing steel and desperate, angry shouts, but the sudden, dramatic death of their dark leader sent a heavy wave of cowardice through the remaining cowardly assassins. Seeing their flawless, masterful plan entirely ruined, they frantically threw down small glass vials that exploded into thick, blinding dark smoke and quickly scattered back into the dark, deep crevices of the high ridges above. The terrifying, bloody ambush dissolved as quickly as it had violently begun, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, terrified silence, broken only by the agonized, painful groans of his wounded royal soldier. Kieran slowly pulled his heavy body up to his unsteady feet, clutching his deeply bleeding right shoulder. He turned his wide, glowing golden eyes to the young guard who stood panting heavily, his silver armor badly dented and completely covered in the dark, bloody ash of the battlefield. Kieran vaguely recognized the boy as a newly appointed royal knight, barely out of his rigorous academy training. The powerful king's normally booming, commanding voice was uncharacteristically quiet and shaky as he demanded to know exactly how the young soldier had anticipated the lethal, silent strike with such impossible, flawless precision. The young, exhausted guard immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head deeply in the utmost total respect. His voice trembled slightly as he bravely spoke, but the absolute pure truth in his simple word struck Kieran harder than any physical, brutal blow ever could. The loyal, brave knight confessed that he had been standing silent guard on the marble courtyard steps exactly 3 days ago. He told the stunned king that he had listened incredibly closely to the banished Omega's desperate tears. He had carefully memorized her frantic, wild warnings about the dark, lengthening shadows and the hidden, deadly poison. He carefully explained that when the heavy fog suddenly rolled in and the ambient temperature suddenly dropped, he recognized every single terrifying detail she had so desperately described. He had bravely broken royal defensive formation solely because he entirely believed the fragile seer's desperate, beautiful prophecy. Kieran felt the breath leave his heavy lungs entirely. The young knight had saved the mighty crown not through superior tactical battle training, but simply because he possessed the basic, simple human decency to listen to a fragile woman everyone else had cruelly discarded. A suffocating, crushing tidal wave of profound, sickening regret crashed entirely over the mighty Alpha King. His massive, muscular frame suddenly felt as terribly weak and hollow as a rotted, dead tree. He looked around the bloodied, violent canyon, witnessing the devastating, brutal cost of his own blind, arrogant ignorance. His absolute finest brave warriors lay broken and bleeding on the cold ground, their innocent blood soaking deeply into the dry canyon earth, exactly as Nova had tearfully warned. He had arrogantly marched them all directly into a brutal slaughterhouse simply because his massive, fragile ego could not handle being publicly corrected by a supposed weak Omega. The agonizing severed edge of the beautiful fated mate bond deep within his heavy chest suddenly flared to violent life, pulling tightly with a desperate, agonizing, painful demand. It was a visceral, intense spiritual tether violently yanking his dark soul directly toward the freezing, desolate northern borderland. Kieran fell heavily to his bruised knees entirely, ignoring the frantic, desperate cries of his royal medics rushing forward to urgently tend his poisoned, bleeding shoulder. The intense physical pain meant absolutely nothing to him right now. He stared blankly at his trembling, bloody hands completely covered in the dark dirt and ash of his own greatest royal failure. He had cruelly mocked her powerful, hidden, magnificent gift, calling her true, beautiful magic a pathetic, weak delusion. He had publicly, painfully humiliated the bravest, kindest soul in his entire vast kingdom simply to stubbornly maintain a false, rigid facade of absolute, total control. He had aggressively banished the only wonderful woman destined to rule powerfully by his side, casting his beautiful, innocent, perfect mate out into the deadliest winter wasteland simply for daring to bravely save his worthless, arrogant life. The horrifying absolute realization completely shattered the final remaining remnants of his towering, foolish pride, leaving behind only a desperate, utterly broken man. He knew with absolute, terrifying, soul-crushing certainty that he absolutely did not deserve her kind forgiveness. He did not deserve the miraculous, breathtaking gift of her perfect sight. But he also knew deep in his burning soul he could not survive another single lonely day without her. The heavy golden crown upon his head felt like heavy, useless lead compared to the desperate burning, wild need to find the beautiful woman he had so foolishly thrown away. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. Kieran refused the frantic healing attempts of his royal medics. The dark poison burned fiercely deep in his right shoulder, but the agonizing physical pain was a necessary penance for his towering arrogance. He slowly pushed his heavy body up from the bloody, trampled dirt of the northern canyon, his golden armor now completely stained with dark ash and deep regret. The young, loyal, brave guard stood quietly nearby, watching his broken king with wide, uncertain eyes. Kieran ordered his surviving commanders to gather the wounded soldiers and return the battered royal convoy to the safety of the capital. He would not lead them any further into these dangerous mountains. He had an entirely different, desperate path to take right now. A lonely path he had to walk completely alone. He stripped away his dented golden chest plate, letting the ruined metal fall carelessly to the cold stone floor. The invisible crown of his proud ancestors felt like a sickening lie upon his brow, so he mentally left that burden behind as well. He was no longer the infallible, mighty Alpha King. He was simply a desperate, terrified mate racing against time to fix the most devastating mistake of his entire life. He commanded the stable master to bring him the fastest, strongest black warhorse in the royal retinue. The massive stallion stamped its iron hooves against the bloody earth, sensing the chaotic energy radiating from its master. Kieran quickly mounted the tall beast, ignoring the sharp tear in his bleeding shoulder. He turned the horse directly north toward the desolate, freezing wastelands where he had cruelly banished the only woman who truly loved him. The journey deep into the treacherous northern borderlands was a brutal, unforgiving nightmare. The dark, starless night swallowed the jagged landscape entirely, leaving only the biting, freezing wind to guide his desperate, lonely path. Kieran pushed the massive black stallion to its absolute physical limits, tearing recklessly through the dense pine forests and jumping blindly over treacherous, icy ravines. Every single frantic mile he traveled further away from the warm safety of the green valley plunged his freezing body deeper into a desolate white hell. The ambient winter temperature dropped rapidly, freezing the cold sweat on his bruised brow and turning his hurried, ragged breaths into thick white smoke. But the punishing physical cold was absolutely nothing compared to the raging, violent, burning inferno deep within his aching chest. The severed, bleeding edge of the beautiful fated mate bond he had so arrogantly rejected was now pulling at his dark soul with an agonizing, demanding force. It was no longer a quiet whisper in the back of his stubborn mind. It was a deafening roar commanding him to immediately find his lost Omega. He could intimately feel her deep, profound, heavy sadness echoing loudly through the fractured magical tether. He could clearly feel her heavy physical exhaustion and her quiet, terrified, lonely resignation. The devastating, crushing realization that he was the absolute sole cause of her immense daily suffering made him violently sick to his stomach. He had looked directly at her glowing silver eyes and seen only a fake threat to his rigid logical order. He had entirely failed to recognize the incredible selfless sacrifice she had bravely made just to stand before him and speak the terrifying truth. As the long, agonizing night slowly bled into a pale gray freezing morning, the howling bitter wind suddenly shifted, carrying a new terrifying heavy scent. Kieran pulled incredibly hard on the heavy wet leather reins, bringing the exhausted panting stallion to a brief necessary halt. He looked up fearfully at the jagged northern horizon, and his warm alpha blood turned to absolute solid ice. A massive, unnatural, towering wall of dark, churning clouds was rapidly swallowing the fragile morning sky. It was not just a simple, heavy winter snowstorm approaching the desolate valley. It was a devastating, catastrophic, deadly whiteout, a violent, churning hurricane of solid, sharp ice and crushing wind tearing directly toward the exact, isolated location of Nova's desolate, freezing exile. The terrifying, horrific realization slammed violently into his heavy, aching heart with the unstoppable force of a falling mountain. She had completely known. She had seen this deadly, crushing storm coming just as clearly as she had seen the hidden poisoned silver blades in the dark canyon. She was out there completely alone in a ruined cabin, waiting for the freezing wrath of nature to bury her alive. Panic, pure, blinding, and absolute, violently seized the mighty broken Alpha King. He dug his heavy leather boots fiercely into the sweaty sides of the tired, loyal stallion, urging the exhausted beast into a final, desperate, reckless gallop. The first heavy flakes of stinging snow began to fall, cutting into his exposed face like tiny glass knives. The howling, loud wind roared aggressively through the dead, frozen trees, sounding exactly like the cruel, mocking laughter of the ancient, powerful fates he had so foolishly, arrogantly defied. The violent, massive storm escalated with terrifying, supernatural speed. Within mere minutes, the entire visible world disappeared completely into a blinding, suffocating, thick wall of absolute, freezing white. Kieran could barely see past the heavy, dark neck of his struggling horse. The freezing, wet snow rapidly accumulated in deep, heavy drifts, slowing the exhausted, loyal beast to a miserable, crawling pace. Kieran absolutely refused to stop moving forward. He quickly dismounted, dropping the heavy, frozen leather reins and pushing his massive, aching body forward through the deep, freezing, drifting snow. He relied entirely on the agonizing, desperate, burning pull of the fractured, bleeding mate bond to guide his blind, freezing steps. His poisoned, bleeding shoulder throbbed with a sickening, blinding, sharp agony, but he actually welcomed the terrible, grounding pain. It kept his fading mind awake. It kept his heavy, tired legs moving forward when his dense, freezing muscles screamed for him to simply lay down and comfortably surrender to the creeping, deadly cold. He staggered blindly up a steep, slippery, icy ridge, his burning lungs screaming with every freezing, ragged breath. Just as his completely numb legs finally gave out entirely beneath him, he saw a tiny, faint, fragile flicker of warm, orange firelight piercing through the deadly whiteout. It was the ruined stone cabin, completely battered and violently shaking under the immense, crushing, heavy weight of the howling winter storm. He dragged his heavy, broken body toward the wooden door, his frozen, numb fingers desperately reaching for the rusty, cold iron latch. But before he could even touch the rough wood, a massive, deafening, sharp crack echoed loudly over the roaring wind, and the heavy wooden ruined roof of the fragile cabin began to violently collapse inward. Kieran threw his heavy, aching shoulder against the splintering wooden door, bursting into the dim, freezing cabin just as the main support beam gave way. The heavy, rotting timber crashed downward, threatening to crush the frail woman standing near the cold stone hearth. Kieran did not think, he simply reacted, fueled by the desperate blazing fire of the mate bond. He threw his massive armored body across the small room, wrapping his strong arms tightly around Nova, and taking the brutal, crushing blow of the heavy falling wood across his own broad back. The violent impact drove them both hard into the freezing dirt floor, sending a blinding cloud of dark dust and white snow swirling violently into the suffocating air. A heavy, terrified silence descended upon the ruined sanctuary, broken only by the howling wind tearing through the collapsed roof. Nova lay pinned beneath the heavy, panting chest of the Alpha King, her wide silver eyes blinking rapidly in absolute shock. She felt the violent, erratic hammering of his terrified heart pressing against her own ribs and smelled the sharp, metallic tang of his dark, dried blood mixing with the heavy scent of winter pine. He was here, the arrogant, powerful king who had cruelly banished her to this frozen wasteland, had somehow crossed the deadly whiteout to find her. Kieran slowly pushed the heavy, broken timber off his back, grunting in intense physical agony as his poisoned shoulder screamed in violent protest. He carefully pushed himself up onto his bruised knees, looking down at the beautiful, fragile Omega he had so completely wronged. His golden eyes were wide and frantic, swimming with a desperate ocean of unshed tears. He frantically checked her pale face and her trembling arms, desperately making sure she was not broken. When he finally realized she was entirely safe, the last remaining shred of his towering royal pride shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. The mighty Alpha King collapsed forward, burying his dirty, tear-stained face into the freezing dirt right beside her small, trembling hands. He wept. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow, but a completely broken, ragged sobbing that violently shook his massive, muscular frame. He begged for her merciful forgiveness, his rough voice cracking and breaking under the immense, crushing weight of his absolute, crushing guilt. He confessed his terrible, blinding arrogance, admitting that his brave, loyal guards had been brutally slaughtered because he was too foolish to listen to her perfect, true voice. He swore upon his own life that he would spend every remaining breath he had making amends for the terrible, unforgiving cruelty he had shown her. He desperately reached out a trembling, bloody hand, wanting to gently touch her pale, cold cheek, wanting to feel the warm, comforting pull of the sacred mate bond he had so violently rejected. But Nova did not weep with sudden, joyful relief. She did not fall gratefully into the warm, waiting arms of her fated mate. A lifetime of deep, painful trauma and cruel rejection had finally forged her fragile glass heart into unbreakable, solid steel. She slowly sat up, brushing the dark dirt from her threadbare cloak, her delicate movements perfectly calm and incredibly deliberate. She looked down at the broken, weeping king kneeling in the freezing dirt and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. She calmly pushed his trembling hand away, refusing to let his desperate, guilty touch break through her protective, heavy armor. She told him that his sudden, desperate tears meant absolutely nothing to her now. She reminded him that he did not banish a liar, he banished a woman who had willingly sacrificed her own safety to save his ungrateful life. She stated with absolute, chilling clarity that he had not braved the deadly winter storm to save her. He had only come here to selfishly soothe his own agonizing, bleeding conscience, because the heavy reality of his massive failure was finally too much for his fragile, arrogant ego to bear. Kieran recoiled as if she had struck him with a heavy iron blade, his golden eyes wide with profound, devastating shock. He had fully expected her deep, beautiful anger, but he was completely unprepared for her absolute, chilling indifference. He looked at the quiet, invisible Omega he had so easily discarded and realized she was completely gone. In her place sat a powerful, unyielding force of nature, a woman who had finally learned how to survive entirely on her own. Nova slowly stood up, her bare feet steady upon the freezing dirt floor. She looked past the broken, weeping king, staring out through the shattered, collapsed roof into the violent, roaring snowstorm. She told him she would never forgive his terrible, unforgiving cruelty, and she would never again. except the broken fated bond he had so easily thrown away. But she also stated that the innocent people of the vast kingdom did not deserve to suffer and die, simply because their arrogant leader was entirely blind to the creeping dark truth. She looked back down at Kieran, her silver eyes glowing with a cold, faint, ethereal light. She demanded a solemn, unbreakable vow. She would agree to return to the capital and use her devastating gift to hunt down the faceless traitors lurking in the shadows. But she would return as an absolute equal, demanding a permanent seat at the High Council table and the absolute, undisputed right to speak the truth without fear of punishment. If he refused her unyielding terms, she would simply stay in this frozen, ruined tomb and let the deadly winter storm claim her tired soul. Kieran stared up at the magnificent, powerful woman standing before him, completely mesmerized by her breathtaking, newfound strength. He slowly bowed his head, pressing his bloody forehead against the freezing dirt, swearing his absolute, eternal fealty to her profound, unyielding wisdom. The broken king had finally surrendered his towering pride, but Nova knew the true, deadly battle was only just beginning. As the heavy wind howled through the broken walls, a sudden, sharp, agonizing pressure began to build behind her glowing silver eyes, warning her that a new, terrible darkness was already waiting for them back at the golden royal gates. The fierce winter storm finally receded by the next morning, leaving behind a pristine world buried under a heavy blanket of brilliant white snow. Nova stepped out of the ruined stone cabin, her boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. Kieran followed her silently, his massive frame moving with a quiet caution that contrasted sharply with his usual dominant presence. He carried the meager supplies she had saved from the collapse, his jaw tight with the lingering agony of his poisoned shoulder. He did not command her or tell her where to walk. He simply stood back, waiting for her to dictate the path. Nova looked at the vast, empty horizon, knowing that returning to the capital meant stepping directly back into the lion's den. She was no longer the frightened, invisible Omega who had been dragged away in chains. She was returning as a sovereign force, bound only by her desire to protect the innocent souls who would perish under a traitor's rule. Kieran led his black warhorse forward, holding the reins with absolute humility. He gently offered her the saddle, refusing to ride himself despite his severe injuries. Nova climbed gracefully onto the tall beast, looking down at the king, who once looked down on her from a golden throne. The journey back toward the heart of the kingdom was slow and grueling. Kieran walked steadily ahead, clearing the treacherous snowy path for her horse. Nova watched his broad back from her high vantage point, her thoughts churning like the winter clouds above. Whenever they stopped to rest, he immediately tended to her comfort before even looking at his own bleeding wounds. He built small roaring fires, using the wet wood he dried with his own body heat. He offered her the finest portions of the dried rations he carried, standing guard in the freezing wind while she ate inside the warmth of the small caves they discovered along the trail. Nova noticed every single small protective act of service. She saw the genuine deep remorse etched into the sharp lines of his face and the quiet reverence in his golden eyes. The arrogant warrior king had completely stripped away his pride, adopting the humble posture of a guardian servant. Yet despite his profound changes, Nova fiercely guarded her wounded heart. She refused to let the soft embers of his regret melt the defensive fortress of ice she had built around her soul. She knew how easily power could corrupt, and how quickly a man could forget his promises once the danger passed. When they sat across from each other by a flickering campfire on the second evening, Kieran broke the heavy silence. His voice was low and rough, carrying the deep resonance of an alpha who had learned the true meaning of humility. He confessed that his greatest regret was the terrible emotional blindness that had allowed him to break her spirit on the palace steps. Nova stared into the dancing orange flames, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She told him directly that his regret was a luxury he could afford only because he had survived. She reminded him that her hidden gift was never meant to be a tool for his convenience. She stated clearly that she was returning to his grand capital for the innocent children and the voiceless Pax who depended on the crown for survival, not to heal his fractured ego or mend a broken mate bond. Kieran bowed his head deeply, accepting her harsh words as a just punishment for his sins. He did not argue or attempt to defend his past actions. He simply reached out and gently placed a dry woolen blanket over her cold shoulders, ensuring she was protected from the creeping midnight chill. His large, warm fingers brushed against the bare skin of her neck for a brief, fleeting second, sending a sudden sharp jolt of electricity rippling through her entire body. The fated mate bond deep within her chest flared to life, crying out for his touch and demanding she surrender to the comfort of his massive embrace. Nova tightly clenched her fists, resisting the overwhelming biological pull with every ounce of her iron willpower. She pulled the blanket tight and turned her back to him, closing her eyes against the sight of his pained golden gaze. She could feel his quiet, watchful presence throughout the long, freezing night, acting as an unbreakable shield between her and the dangerous wilderness. It was a slow, torturous burn, a silent battle between her lingering desire for her fated match and her absolute refusal to ever be minimized again. By the dawn of the third day, the jagged mountains gave way to the fertile green valleys of the royal territory. The grand golden gates of the capital city appeared on the horizon, gleaming brilliantly under the sun. Nova felt a familiar tightness grip her throat as they approached the outer perimeter. She looked at the towering stone walls that had witnessed her ultimate public humiliation. Kieran stepped to the side of her horse, his hand resting gently on the stirrup to offer silent support. He looked up at her with unyielding devotion, promising that this time she would enter his kingdom as an absolute equal. But before Nova could respond, a sudden wave of nausea washed over her. The air around them grew heavy and still, smelling faintly of copper and rot. The skin on the back of her neck began to prickle fiercely with an ominous warning. She looked up at the high battlements of the city gates and noticed several cloaked figures watching their approach from the shadows. The traitors were already aware of the king's survival, and they were waiting for them in the dark corners of the court. The massive iron portcullis of the royal capital groaned open, revealing the bustling lower courtyard. Nova rode through the towering stone archway, feeling the heavy weight of 1,000 eyes upon her shoulders. The common folk stopped their busy market trading, staring in absolute shocked silence. They recognized the frail Omega, who had been brutally banished in absolute disgrace just a few short days ago. Now she returned upon the king's own steed, while the mighty Alpha King walked humbly beside her, his golden armor battered and stained with dried blood. Whispers rippled through the dense, crowded square like dry leaves caught in a sudden fierce autumn wind. Kieran kept his shoulders straight, his golden eyes scanning the high balconies for any hidden threats. He rested his large, warm hand gently upon her leather bridle, silently offering his steady strength. Nova wanted to pull away, but before she could shift her weight, a catastrophic force violently slammed into her very soul. It was a massive, agonizing explosion of pure volatile magic, tearing through her fragile mind with the devastating force of a falling star. The bright midday sun shining high above the beautiful capital instantly blackened in her sensitive vision, completely replaced by a terrifying, consuming darkness. A horrific, deafening, ringing sound shattered her eardrums, drowning out the loud, panicked gasps of the surrounding crowd. Nova lost all physical control of her trembling mortal body. She slipped sideways from the high saddle, tumbling down toward the hard, unforgiving cobblestones below. Kieran moved with blinding supernatural speed. He caught her fragile body before she struck the hard ground, wrapping his muscular arms tightly around her convulsing frame. He fell to his armored knees in the center of the crowded courtyard, cradling her desperately against his broad, solid chest. He screamed frantically for his healers, his booming voice echoing off the high stone walls, but Nova could barely hear his desperate cries. The vivid vision had already dragged her consciousness away from his arms and violently thrown her into the dark depths of the impending future. She was standing entirely invisible inside the grand circular chamber of the Royal High Council. The stone doors were securely locked. The heavy air in the dark room was completely thick with the sickening, suffocating scent of burning dark sage and highly toxic wolfsbane. She saw the 6 most trusted noble elders of the kingdom standing in a tight circle around the grand ancient map of the realm. Their faces were twisted into ugly, cruel sneers, illuminated only by the unnatural, sickly green glow of dark, forbidden magic. The absolute highest advisor to the crown, the very man who had mentored Kieran since he was a young, grieving boy, was holding a heavy ceremonial dagger entirely made of black, cursed obsidian. Nova felt a phantom burning agony rip through her throat, mirroring the silent deaths of the loyal guards standing outside. She watched in frozen horror as the High Advisor plunged the cursed dagger into the center of the grand map, marking the king's sleeping chamber. The terrifying vision violently shifted forward through the looming threads of fate. She saw the iron gates being thrown wide open, allowing a hidden army of rogue shadow wolves to flood the sleeping capital. She saw the white marble courtyard stained with innocent blood and heard the agonizing screams of defenseless children trapped within the burning district. The ancient dark magic forced her to physically feel the terrible, crushing despair of a kingdom violently collapsing from within. And hovering above the absolute chaos, burning brightly like a terrible dark star, was the inevitable, unyielding timeline. 3 days. The traitorous High Council was planning to strike the final devastating blow during the Grand Eclipse Festival in exactly 3 short days. The magical tether finally snapped, bringing her consciousness crashing back into her trembling body. Nova gasped loudly for air, her back arching deeply in Kieran's tight, desperate embrace. The blinding ethereal silver light pouring fiercely from her wide, terrified eyes illuminated the king's pale, panicked face. The entire crowded square had fallen into a terrifying dead silence, watching the cursed Omega glow with the awesome, terrifying power of the ancient fates. Kieran held her incredibly tight, his own heart hammering wildly against her ribs. He begged her to speak, to tell him what terrible tragedy she had just endured. Nova slowly raised her trembling hand, grabbing his torn tunic with surprising strength. The silver light slowly began to fade from her tired eyes, leaving behind a cold, absolute certainty that chilled the mighty king to his very dense bones. She did not cry or panic. She looked directly into his terrified golden eyes, and her quiet, steady voice carried across the silent stone courtyard for every single person to hear. She told him that the deadly poison that nearly took his life in the canyon was poured by the very hands that placed the golden crown upon his royal head. She revealed that his most trusted High Advisor was bathing in dark, forbidden magic, and that in exactly 3 days the entire city would burn to the ground if they did not strike first. Kieran stared at her in absolute, horrific shock, realizing the massive political nightmare they were now trapped inside. Before the king could process the devastating truth, the heavy gates swung open, and the very High Advisor she had just accused walked calmly out into the courtyard, surrounded by elite royal guard, all pointing their steel directly at the king and his mate. The old High Advisor smiled a thin, cold smile, his dark eyes fixed on the trembling king. He loudly declared that the treacherous winter journey had clearly infected the king with madness, and that the cursed Omega was manipulating his royal mind with dangerous, dark magic. He ordered his loyal elite guards to seize them both immediately for the good of the realm. But Kieran did not cower or step back. He rose to his full, massive, towering height, pulling Nova securely behind his broad, armored back, protecting her from their drawn steel. His golden alpha eyes flared with a terrifying, dominant power that instantly paralyzed the advancing guard. He roared that he was still the undisputed king, and he demanded a full emergency gathering of the High Council in the Grand War Room immediately. The terrified guards hesitated, looking nervously between the furious, massive king and the calm Advisor before slowly lowering their steel weapons in absolute submission. The Advisor simply bowed his head, hiding a wicked, dark smirk, and agreed to the royal command, knowing his deadly trap was already perfectly set. The Grand War Room was a massive circular chamber built from dark, polished stone, located deep within the highest tower of the ancient citadel. The 6 noble elders sat around the giant, ancient map of the kingdom, whispering fiercely among themselves, plotting their final deadly moves. When Kieran entered the heavy room, he did not send Nova to wait safely in the dark shadows, as he once would have done in the blind, ignorant past. He firmly gripped her small pale hand and led her directly to the head of the heavy oak table, completely ignoring the shocked whispers of the powerful lords. He pulled out the heavy wooden chair beside his own and commanded her to sit right at his right hand, elevating her above them all. The arrogant council members gasped in absolute pure outrage, their faces turning red with deep sudden fury. A fragile banished Omega had absolutely no right to even breathe the air in this sacred room, let alone sit beside the mighty Alpha King. The High Advisor slammed his fist upon the table, demanding she be removed immediately, calling her a filthy, dangerous liar who had entirely bewitched the crown. But Nova did not shrink away from their hateful, cruel glare. The terrified, invisible girl she used to be was completely dead and gone forever, buried in the frozen wasteland. She slowly stood up, her beautiful silver eyes glowing faintly in the dim, flickering torchlight. She looked directly at the arrogant High Advisor and began to speak with a calm, chilling authority that instantly silenced the entire giant chamber. She did not yell or cry or beg for their belief. She simply detailed exactly what she had seen in the painful, blinding vision. She described the heavy, dark sage currently burning in his private, hidden chambers, masking the scent of betrayal. She described the illegal, poisonous wolfsbane hidden securely beneath the stone floorboards of his grand, noble estate. She looked down at the ancient map and pointed exactly to the royal sleeping chambers, describing the cursed black obsidian dagger he planned to plunge into the king's heart during the eclipse festival. Every single incredibly specific detail she bravely revealed made the haughty elders grow paler and paler with raw, absolute terror. They shifted uncomfortably, realizing she knew their darkest, deepest secrets without ever stepping foot inside their private, heavily guarded home. Her powerful, true voice was steady and absolute, completely stripping away their false, noble pride. The High Advisor desperately tried to interrupt her powerful truth, screaming loudly that she was a dark witch speaking treasonous, wicked lies to destroy the kingdom. He aggressively demanded the king execute her right there on the hard stone floor before she could speak another word. But Kieran stood up, his massive, powerful presence filling the entire room with an overwhelming, heavy, dominant pressure. He gently placed his warm, heavy hand upon Nova's frail shoulder, publicly displaying his absolute, unwavering support for his beautiful, fated mate. He told the frightened council that he had arrogantly ignored her brilliant, perfect truth once before, and it had nearly cost him his own life and his entire kingdom. He swore upon his royal ancient blood that if any man dared to speak a single harsh word against her, he would personally separate their arrogant head from their trembling shoulders. He proudly declared Nova to be the true guiding voice of the crown and ordered the immediate, thorough search of the advisor's private estate. He proved in front of the entire kingdom that he would never silence her powerful voice ever again, and that her word was now absolute law. The royal guards rushed out of the massive room to execute the king's strict command, leaving a heavy, terrifying silence behind in the dark chamber. The council members began to sweat profusely, realizing their massive conspiracy was rapidly crumbling to absolute dust before their very eyes. Nova looked closely at the old High Advisor, fully expecting to see absolute terror in his dark, cold eyes as his vile treason was exposed. But he was not afraid at all. The old man simply smiled, a wide, unnatural, chilling smile that made her warm blood run entirely cold with sudden new dread. He slowly reached deep into his heavy silken robes and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a glowing, sickly green liquid. He looked directly at Nova, his cruel voice dripping with pure dark malice and arrogant triumph. He told her she was incredibly gifted to see his grand design, but she was ultimately far too late to stop the ancient wheels of fate. He raised the glowing glass vial high above his head and violently smashed it against the hard stone floor. A massive, horrific shockwave of pure dark magic exploded through the war room, instantly plunging the entire ancient citadel into absolute pitch-black darkness as the deafening, terrifying sound of a thousand warning bells suddenly began to ring throughout the panic-stricken city. The absolute pitch-black darkness swallowed the massive circular war room instantly. A terrifying, unnatural cold swept over the ancient stone floors, completely extinguishing the warm ambient heat of the heavy torches. Nova felt Kieran immediately wrap his massive muscular arms around her fragile body, pulling her tight against his heavy golden armor. The chaotic, deafening sounds of clashing steel and panicked shouting erupted all around them in the suffocating dark. The High Advisor had unleashed his hidden dark magic, summoning deadly shadow creatures directly into the High Council chamber to execute his wicked treason. Kieran did not hesitate for a single second. He lifted Nova entirely off the hard stone floor, cradling her securely against his broad chest as he blindly charged toward the heavy iron door. He used his immense alpha strength to kick the heavy wooden barricade, shattering the thick iron locks with a single devastating blow. They burst out into the long, torchlit corridor, just as a massive shadowy beast lunged at their heels, snapping its terrible jaws at the empty air. Kieran carried her frantically through the winding stone hallways of the ancient citadel, rushing past terrified fleeing servants and bewildered royal guard. He knew they needed an absolute secure fortress to prepare for the massive impending siege. He brought them deep into the ancient royal armory, a highly fortified stone bunker located deep beneath the main palace. He slammed the massive heavy steel doors shut, completely locking the heavy iron deadbolts, sliding into place with a deafening, echoing boom. They were finally completely alone in the dim, flickering light of a single dying lantern. The heavy, thick walls of the ancient armory muffled the chaotic, terrifying sounds of the raging battle echoing above them. Kieran carefully set Nova down upon a simple wooden bench, his massive chest heaving heavily as he desperately gasped for the damp, cold air. He immediately dropped to his bruised knees before her, completely ignoring the deep, throbbing agony in his poisoned right shoulder. He frantically checked her pale face and trembling hands, desperately ensuring the dark shadow magic had not touched her fragile skin. Nova looked down at the mighty Alpha King kneeling humbly at her feet, his golden eyes swimming with absolute deep terror for her personal safety. The heavy, thick walls of ice she had carefully built around her wounded heart finally began to crack under the immense pure weight of his genuine raw devotion. She saw the absolute truth written clearly across his exhausted, dirty face. He was no longer the arrogant, proud king who had cruelly banished her to the freezing wasteland. He was simply a terrified, desperate man, fiercely determined to protect the only beautiful woman he had ever truly loved. He reached out and gently took her cold hands in his own, rubbing his warm, calloused thumbs over her pale knuckles. He did not ask for her immediate forgiveness, but rather he silently offered his entire soul as a shield against the creeping dark tide. The quiet bunker felt incredibly small and intimate, completely stripping away their royal titles and heavy burdens, leaving only two fragile souls clinging to each other in the terrifying dark. She slowly reached out her trembling small hand and gently placed her warm palm against his rough, bearded cheek. Kieran instantly leaned into her soft, gentle touch, letting out a ragged, broken sigh that completely shattered the heavy, tense silence of the small stone room. He closed his glowing golden eyes, pressing his warm face deep into her fragile palm desperately, seeking the calm, steady comfort of her powerful, beautiful soul. He whispered softly that he was entirely terrified of losing her again. He confessed that his massive, wealthy kingdom meant absolutely nothing without her brilliant, guiding light shining beside him. Nova felt the powerful, ancient, fated mate bond deep within her chest violently flare to magnificent life, singing a beautiful, triumphant song of true, absolute connection. She finally allowed the deep, warm embers of their slow burn romance to gently catch fire completely, melting away the cold, bitter resentment she had carried for so incredibly long. She whispered back that they would face the terrible, encroaching darkness entirely together, not as a commanding king and a broken, silent Omega, but as absolute, equal, sovereign partners. She leaned forward and pressed her soft lips gently against his bruised forehead, offering him the absolute quiet strength he so desperately needed. It was their first true moment of profound intimacy, an incredibly deep spiritual tether finally clicking perfectly into place, locking their intertwined destinies together forever. They sat closely together in the dim, quiet bunker, frantically preparing their defensive strategies for the massive, horrific battle they knew was rapidly approaching. Nova focused her brilliant, glowing silver eyes, pushing her magical sight past the heavy, thick stone walls to track the terrifying, violent movements of the shadow army above. She calmly told him exactly where the dark magical beasts were gathering, perfectly predicting their highly coordinated, brutal strike. Kieran listened to her every single word with absolute pure reverence, carefully sharpening his heavy broadsword and checking the thick leather straps of his battered golden armor. It was a deeply profound, quiet moment of true magical synergy, completely blending his massive raw physical power with her incredible, magnificent foresight. But their beautiful, fragile moment of absolute connection was violently cut short. The single dying lantern swinging gently above their heads suddenly violently flared blindingly, bright before completely burning out, plunging the small fortified bunker into deep, terrifying shadows. A horrific, unnatural, massive shockwave violently rocked the deep underground armory violently, shaking the heavy stone foundation beneath their feet. The terrible High Advisor had prematurely triggered the devastating ancient eclipse ritual, using the spilled innocent blood above to violently force the golden sun from the daytime sky. The heavy steel doors of their absolute safe sanctuary suddenly began to warp and violently buckle inward as a massive, terrifying dark force forcefully slammed against the iron locks, perfectly signaling the violent, horrific beginning of the absolute end. The heavy iron doors of the underground armory groaned and twisted under the immense weight of the dark magic pressing from the outside. Nova could feel the violent vibrations rattling through her teeth as the very foundations of the citadel trembled. The false twilight of the premature eclipse had cast the entire world into a sickening purple hue that seeped through the cracks of the stone ceiling. Beside her, Kieran stood like a mountain of unyielding resolve, his broadsword drawn and his golden eyes blazing with the fierce light of a true alpha protector. He shifted his weight, placing himself directly between her and the fracturing entrance. "Do not fear, my beautiful star," he whispered, his rough voice cutting through the terrifying roar of the dark magic outside. "I will hold this line until my very last breath." Nova gripped his leather gauntlet tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not doubt his incredible bravery, but her silver sight was showing her the terrifying truth behind the steel door. The High Advisor had sacrificed the innocent blood of the court to fuel this ancient curse, and the shadowy abominations he had summoned were entirely immune to mortal steel. The iron bolts violently snapped one by one with the deafening sound of cracking thunder. With a final catastrophic explosion of dark energy, the massive steel doors vanished into a cloud of jagged black shards and thick, suffocating smoke. The old High Advisor stepped through the ruins, his silken robes stained with blood and his eyes completely overtaken by a hollow, blinding emerald green light. Shadowy wraiths with elongated claws and featureless faces swarmed around his feet, hissing like vipers in the cold air. "You cannot outrun destiny," Kieran the traitor laughed, his voice echoing with a horrific resonance that made the stones weep. "The crown belongs to the new order, and your little seer will watch you burn." Kieran roared a defiant battle cry and charged forward, his heavy boots throwing up clouds of stone dust as he swung his massive blade. He was a whirlwind of raw physical destruction, cutting down 3 of the shadow beasts in a single magnificent sweep. But for every wraith he destroyed, 2 more emerged from the swirling darkness. The dark magic clung to his golden armor, eating away at the pristine metal and slowing his powerful movement. The Advisor raised his skeletal hands, chanting an ancient guttural curse that caused the ambient gravity in the room to multiply 100-fold. Kieran gasped, his knees violently buckling under the sudden, immense, crushing pressure. He struggled to raise his sword, his massive muscles straining to the absolute breaking point, but the dark emerald energy bound his limbs like heavy chains of solid iron. Nova watched in frozen horror as the shadow beasts converged on her fated mate, their sharp claws tearing through his leather guards and drawing deep crimson blood. Kieran let out an agonized groan, refusing to yield even as his strength rapidly waned. He looked back at her through the swirling smoke, his golden eyes desperate and pleading. "Run, Nova," he choked out, his voice filled with a devastating pure love that shattered the final remains of her hesitation. "Save yourself." The sight of her proud warrior king broken and bleeding on the cold floor sparked a terrifying transformation deep within Nova's soul. She looked down at her small trembling hands and realized that running was a luxury she could no longer afford. For her entire life she had feared her hidden magic, treating it as a violent curse that only brought suffering and isolation. She had hidden in the background, begging to be invisible, so that the cruel world would leave her in peace. But as she watched the man who had humbled himself in the dirt for her sake prepare to die, her fear transformed into an absolute blinding white-hot rage. She was not a victim of fate. She was its chosen vessel. She stopped fighting the heavy, suffocating pressure behind her eyes and completely opened the floodgates of her soul. The ancient temporal magic that had slumbered within her bloodline for generations suddenly awoke with a deafening silent roar. A blinding column of brilliant, radiant silver light erupted from her fragile form, tearing through the dark purple twilight and vaporizing the shadow wraiths nearest to her in an instant. Her long dark hair floated around her face as if suspended in water, and her wide eyes glowed with a magnificent, blinding silver luminescence that completely eclipsed the advisor's dark green magic. Nova stepped forward, her bare feet leaving glowing silver footprints on the scorched earth. The heavy iron chains binding Kieran instantly shattered into harmless dust under the sheer, immense pressure of her awakening. She could feel the vast threads of past, present, and future spinning rapidly around her fingers, ready to be woven at her command. She looked at the terrified High Advisor, her voice now carrying the awesome multi-layered resonance of a goddess. "You thought you could rewrite fate," she whispered, her words shaking the very core of the citadel. "But you forgot that I am the one who holds the thread." The old traitor stumbled backward, his arrogant smile completely vanishing as he realized he was no longer facing a weak, discarded Omega, but the terrifying birth of the legendary Oracle Queen. The blinding column of radiant silver light expanding from Nova did not just illuminate the dark underground armory, it completely altered the flow of temporal energy within the room. She stood suspended in the brilliant, shimmering ether, her inner mind expanding to encompass the invisible tapestry of the entire kingdom. The intense fear that had paralyzed her for a lifetime evaporated into the warm, glowing currents of absolute truth. She could see every path available, every choice the High Advisor had ever made, and every wicked deed he intended to commit. The silver light did not feel like a violent curse anymore, it felt like home. She realized her ancestors had not been broken seers hiding from the world, they had been the glorious guardians of destiny itself. Her inner voice whispered a soft final farewell to the quiet, invisible girl she used to be. The oppressed Omega, who had wept in the dark cellars of her childhood, was gone forever, replaced by a sovereign force of nature that commanded the very fabric of time and fate. She watched the old traitor cower from her radiant majesty, his emerald green magic sputtering out like a dying candle under the immense weight of her magnificent awakening. Kieran pushed himself up from the hard stone floor, his golden eyes reflecting the magnificent silver crown of energy that now rested upon her brow. He looked at her not with the familiar protective dominance of an alpha, but with an enduring sacred reverence. He realized that the woman he had once foolishly banished was far greater than any earthly monarch or warrior pack leader. The High Advisor let out a desperate, terrified screech, commandingly raising his skeletal arms to summon the remaining dark wraiths from the deepest shadows of the room. The dark monsters lunged forward, their black claws snapping hungrily at the silver light that filled the air. But before the dark beasts could even cross the stone floor, Nova simply extended her pale arm, making a gentle sweeping motion with her open hand. The silver light flared exponentially, pulsing outward in a beautiful silent wave of raw power that instantly dissolved the shadow wraiths into harmless shimmering dust. The dark emerald green runes etched onto the ancient stone walls shattered into a million inert pieces, completely neutralizing the forbidden eclipse ritual. Nova landed softly on her feet, her glowing silver eyes locked onto the shivering old man who had tried to destroy everything she loved. "You have stolen your last breath from this kingdom," she stated with absolute sovereign authority, her voice echoing with the majestic weight of 1,000 ancient queens. The old High Advisor let out a final ragged gasp as his stolen dark magic completely backfired, wrapping around his own trembling limbs and trapping him in an inescapable cage of his own wicked design. He collapsed to the hard floor, entirely defeated by the undeniable presence of the true Oracle Queen. As the silver luminescence began to settle into a steady calm radiance, Nova turned her gaze back to Kieran. She could feel the profound depths of his devotion vibrating through the fated mate bond, which was no longer a bleeding wound, but a brilliant golden bridge connecting their souls completely. He approached her slowly, dropping his heavy broadsword to the floor and kneeling before her with absolute humility. He did not speak a word of his past arrogance, because his entire posture was a living testament to his complete submission to her power. Nova reached down and touched his face, her fingers channeling a soft healing warmth that instantly closed the bleeding wounds on his chest and drove the remaining wolfsbane poison from his veins. "Rise, Kieran," she said softly, helping the mighty king stand as her absolute equal partner in this broken world. The darkness in the bunker had been completely conquered, but the real battle for the kingdom was waiting just beyond the threshold. The continuous ringing of the warning bells outside the citadel walls grew louder, carrying the frantic terror of a people trapped in an unnatural night. Nova closed her eyes for a brief second, letting her temporal sight stretch outward across the capital city. She saw the royal guard fighting a losing battle against the rogue shadow wolves at the eastern gates, and she saw the terrified citizens screaming for a leader who had disappeared into the dark. The High Advisor was defeated, but his treasonous army was still tearing the kingdom apart piece by piece. Nova looked at Kieran, her eyes flashing with a renewed silver fire as she realized they needed to show the entire world that the true rulers had returned. "We must go to the grand courtyard," she declared, her voice firm and unyielding. "The people need to see the truth, and the traitors need to face their final judgment before the sun sets completely." Kieran nodded, his golden eyes burning with an intense warrior light as he gripped her hand firmly. Together they walked out of the ruined armory, stepping into the chaotic smoke-filled corridors of the palace, ready to confront the ultimate test of their combined power. The heavy oak doors of the grand courtyard shattered outward as Nova and Kieran emerged from the dark corridors of the ancient palace. The chaotic din of the massive battle instantly washed over them, a terrifying symphony of clashing steel and desperate screams echoing through the unnatural twilight. The once pristine marble square was completely overrun by the shadowy rogue wolves fighting ruthlessly against the exhausted remnants of the royal elite guard. Dark, thick smoke billowed from the outer towers, completely obscuring the stars and choking the desperate citizens who huddled in the distant corners. But the moment Nova stepped onto the high stone balcony overlooking the bloody massacre, the violent atmosphere suddenly shifted. The blinding radiant silver luminescence of her oracle power spilled out over the ruined courtyard, cutting through the thick purple darkness like a magnificent celestial blade. The sheer immense pressure of her awakened magic washed over the battlefield, instantly paralyzing the rogue beasts and freezing the desperate combatants in their track. Kieran stood proudly beside her, no longer stepping in front to shield her, but standing shoulder to shoulder as an equal sovereign. His golden armor glowed brilliantly in the reflection of her pure silver light, his presence a massive unyielding anchor of pure alpha strength. Nova looked down at the chaotic sea of terrified faces and felt a profound, deep well of compassion completely replace her lifelong fear. She was no longer the silenced, invisible Omega. She was the absolute reigning voice of the ancient fates. She raised her pale hands, and the silver light expanded violently outward, rippling across the grand courtyard in a breathtaking wave of pure temporal energy. The dark shadow wolves, the corrupted beasts summoned by the High Advisor's treasonous magic, shrieked in absolute terror as the silver light touched their corrupted fur. They did not bleed or fall, they simply dissolved into harmless ash, their dark, unnatural existence completely erased by the absolute, undeniable truth of her magnificent power. A stunned, deafening silence fell over the entire capital city, broken only by the gentle sound of the howling wind. The royal guards dropped their heavy dented shields, staring up at the high balcony in pure unadulterated awe. They saw their mighty Alpha King kneeling humbly beside the very woman he had once cruelly banished, publicly demonstrating his absolute submission to her divine wisdom. But the final judgment was not yet complete. From the dark, shattered remains of the armory doors, the defeated High Advisor was dragged out into the open courtyard by two loyal guards, his silken robes torn and his arrogant face twisted into a mask of pure desperate terror. He was thrown violently to the hard cobblestones right below the high balcony, forced to look up at the radiant, magnificent queen he had tried to destroy. Nova looked down at the trembling old man, her silver eyes burning with the weight of 1,000 untold futures. She did not raise her voice to a scream. She spoke with a calm, melodic resonance that echoed clearly into the very souls of every citizen present. She exposed every single dark secret he had buried in the shadows. She detailed the innocent lives he had sacrificed, the dark, forbidden magic he had hoarded, and the absolute ruin he had planned for their vast, beautiful kingdom. Her powerful words were not just accusations, they were living, breathing truths that manifested as vivid, shimmering visions in the air above the courtyard, forcing every single person to witness his wicked treason with their own eyes. The people gasped in horrific shock, watching the undeniable, absolute proof of his deep betrayal. The High Advisor scrambled backward on his hands and knees, weeping pathetically and begging the crowd for mercy, but his false noble facade was completely shattered forever. Kieran stepped forward, resting his heavy hand gently upon Nova's waist, his golden eyes fixed fiercely upon the pathetic traitor. The mighty king declared with a booming voice that the absolute highest law of the pack was no longer dictated by blind power or cruel tradition, but by the undeniable sacred truth spoken by the Oracle Queen. He announced that the traitor would not be granted a swift, honorable warrior death, but would be stripped of his noble name and banished to the deep, forgotten caves beneath the mountains where his dark magic could never again touch the surface world. The royal guards moved forward, instantly binding the screaming old man in heavy iron chains and dragging him away into the deep, dark shadows, forever removing his vile poison from the royal court. The massive crowd slowly fell to their knees, bowing their heads in profound, deep reverence, not out of terrifying fear, but out of absolute, genuine awe and pure gratitude. They had witnessed the terrifying brink of total destruction, and they had been miraculously saved by the very soul they had so cruelly ignored. Nova looked out over the bowing masses, her heart overflowing with a beautiful, profound peace she had never known before. The terrifying, crushing visions of bloody canyons and ruined cabins were finally replaced by a magnificent golden tapestry of hope and profound healing. She turned to Kieran, seeing the deep, unspeakable love radiating from his handsome, bruised face. The dark, unnatural eclipse above finally began to break apart, the thick purple clouds separating to reveal the brilliant, warm light of the afternoon sun, bathing the ruined courtyard in a beautiful, glorious golden glow. The ancient, oppressive kingdom of silence and fear was completely dead, and the magnificent new era of the Oracle Queen had finally begun. But as the crowd cheered, a single new golden vision flashed across her silver eyes, clearly revealing that her greatest monumental challenge was no longer surviving the creeping darkness, but completely rewriting the ancient, ruthless laws of the entire world. The morning sun poured heavily through the high, stained glass windows of the grand throne room, casting vibrant, beautiful pools of colored light across the ancient, polished marble floor. The heavy, oppressive silence that had choked the palace for centuries was completely gone, replaced by the nervous, anxious shifting of the remaining noble lords. They stood in a wide circle around the base of the golden dais, their heads bowed low in absolute, terrified submission. At the center of the dais sat Nova, not upon a secondary wooden stool, but upon a newly forged, magnificent throne of solid silver that stood entirely equal in height to the king's ancient golden seat. She wore no heavy crowns of suffocating metal, only a simple, beautiful woven circlet of white winter, flowers that Kieran had personally braided for her at dawn. Her bright silver eyes were calm and incredibly clear, sweeping over the assembled proud lords who had once treated her as invisible, worthless dirt. Beside her, Kieran stood incredibly tall and proud, his massive hands resting easily on the pommel of his sheathed broadsword, completely content to let his beautiful mate command the massive room. Nova did not wait for the traditional pompous introductions to begin the historic gathering. She spoke with a melodic, absolute authority that resonated powerfully through the vast chamber, commanding total, unwavering attention. She firmly declared that the ancient, ruthless laws of the pack, the rigid, cruel hierarchies that valued brute physical strength over spiritual wisdom, were completely and permanently abolished. The gathered lords gasped in collective horrific shock, their aristocratic faces paling, but not a single arrogant man dared to speak out against the powerful Oracle Queen. Nova continued, her voice unwavering and incredibly strong as she detailed the massive, monumental changes sweeping across the land. No longer would the fragile Omegas and the physically weak be violently banished to the freezing borders to die in agonizing silence. They would be immediately brought into the very warm heart of the capital, given the absolute highest education, and fiercely protected as the sacred spiritual backbone of the entire kingdom. She systematically dismantled the brutal military conscription laws that cruelly tore young pups from their weeping mothers and absolutely abolished the horrific dark isolation cellars where gifted children exactly like herself had been tortured simply for speaking the profound truth. Every single historic decree was a heavy magical hammer blow, completely shattering the ancient, oppressive foundations of their deeply flawed society. A frail old lord eventually stepped forward, his voice trembling violently as he respectfully asked how the vast kingdom would successfully defend itself against outside threats without their traditional ruthless warrior tradition. Kieran immediately stepped forward, ready to roar the frightened man into complete submission, but Nova gently placed her small hand on his heavy armored arm, peacefully stopping him. She looked directly at the trembling old lord, her glowing silver eyes shining with a warm, reassuring, beautiful light. She patiently explained that true monumental strength did not come from terrorizing their own innocent people, but from cultivating a deeply unified kingdom where every single soul had a vital, celebrated purpose. She gently raised her pale hand and showed them a fleeting, shimmering silver vision of the near future, projecting the magnificent image directly into the air above the royal throne. The stunned lords watched in pure absolute awe as they saw a vast, beautiful sunlit academy where incredibly strong warriors trained seamlessly alongside gifted, powerful seers, their combined unique powers creating an absolutely impenetrable magical and physical defense. The glowing vision was so breathtakingly perfect and deeply harmonious that several of the oldest hardened lords actually openly wept, realizing exactly how much magnificent potential they had foolishly squandered in the cold dark. The deep, agonizing trauma of her broken childhood was finally being completely rewritten into a powerful legacy of hope. Kieran looked down at his beautiful, powerful made, his glowing golden eyes burning with an incredibly deep, overwhelming pride and profound love. He stepped forward, addressing the completely silent court with a booming alpha voice that left absolutely no room for hesitation or doubt. He loudly swore a sacred eternal blood oath before the ancient goddess and all his assembled people that he would fiercely enforce the Queen's new compassionate laws with the absolute full might of his massive royal army. He boldly declared that any proud alpha who dared to mistreat a weaker wolf or violently suppress a gifted innocent child would immediately answer directly to his heavy, unforgiving blade. The monumental historic shift in absolute royal power was completely finished. The vast kingdom was no longer ruled by the iron fist of a single arrogant man, but guided perfectly by the brilliant infinite wisdom of a united equal sovereign pair. The noble lords instantly dropped to their trembling knees, swearing their eternal desperate fealty to the beautiful new dawn, entirely acknowledging that their glorious ancient kingdom had finally been miraculously rescued from the terrifying brink of total self-destruction. As the heavy formal proceedings finally concluded, and the exhausted lords slowly filed out of the grand throne room, a deep, profound, heavy peace settled over Nova's tired soul. She leaned back heavily against her cool silver throne, letting out a long, soft, shaky sigh. Kieran immediately knelt right beside her, gently taking her small, pale hand and pressing his warm, soft lips deeply to her bruised knuckles. He murmured softly that she had completely, miraculously rebuilt their entire broken world in a single beautiful morning. Nova smiled warmly, her fragile heart soaring with a pure, radiant, profound joy she had absolutely never thought possible. She had bravely taken all her deep, agonizing childhood trauma and successfully transformed it into a magnificent, unbreakable shield for the innocent. But exactly as she looked down lovingly at the massive man who had humbly bowed his entire powerful soul to elevate hers, a sudden, sharp, terrifying chill violently swept through the warm throne room. The delicate white winter flowers in her woven crown suddenly withered and turned entirely black. The ancient fated mate bond deep within her chest gave a violent, unnatural, agonizing tug, pointing directly toward the treacherous, dark eastern sea. Her glowing silver eyes widened in sudden, absolute, pure terror as a new, dark, horrifying vision violently crashed into her mind, revealing that the banished High Advisor had not acted entirely alone, and an even older, terrifying ancient evil was already silently sailing toward their peaceful golden shores. The golden sun reached its zenith over the capital, casting a brilliant light that seemed to mirror the newfound clarity within the palace walls. The Grand Academy, constructed in the heart of the city, was now a bustling sanctuary of learning and collaboration. Nova stood upon the high balcony of the central training hall, watching as the new generation of students moved through the courtyard. It was a sight that once would have been considered impossible. Young warriors wearing the silver crest of the kingdom practiced their tactical movements alongside young seers whose eyes glowed with the soft luminescence of their budding gifts. They were not separated by fear or suspicion, but were learning to bridge the gap between physical protection and spiritual insight. The academy was designed as an open campus where the natural flow of air and light encouraged constant interaction. Nova watched a group of young pups carefully navigating a complex maze while their seer partners guided them through the shifting paths, using nothing but their shared mental connection. It was the physical manifestation of the new covenant she had established with Kieran. She felt a warm presence beside her and did not need to turn to know that the king had joined her on the balcony. Kieran stood with his arms crossed, his golden armor gleaming in the afternoon sun, but his posture was relaxed and grounded. He watched the students with a sense of wonder that had only grown since the day they had finally returned from the cold northern mountain. He had traded the rigid drills of the old army for a curriculum that prioritized understanding and patience. The warriors now spent as much time in the silent meditation halls as they did on the training fields, and the seers were given the authority to lead the strategic council alongside the top military commander. Nova felt his hand rest gently on the small of her back, a comforting weight that anchored her to the present moment. They had successfully integrated the two most powerful elements of their society, but she knew that the structure was still fragile. It required constant vigilance and the daily demonstration of their commitment to equality. She looked down at the courtyard where a young girl with silver hair was sitting on a stone bench sharing a simple meal with a teenage swordsman. They were laughing and talking with the easy grace of friends who understood that their differences were their greatest collective strength. This was the legacy she had fought for. The academy was more than just a school, it was the heartbeat of the new kingdom. It was proof that the shadow of the past could be outrun by the persistent light of a better future. Kieran spoke, his voice deep and steady like the rolling earth beneath them. They are learning to trust each other, Nova. That is the true victory. The old ways were built on the idea that we needed to fear the unknown, but these children are being raised to welcome it. Nova nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the mountains stood silent and majestic. She remembered the frozen cabin, and the biting wind that had once threatened to extinguish her very soul. She had been convinced that her gift was a curse meant to lead her into isolation, but now she saw it as the foundation of everything they had built. She had not only survived the darkness, she had transformed it into a beacon. The council of elders that had once plotted their downfall was now completely comprised of those who had shown the greatest capacity for growth and empathy. Even the most stubborn traditionalists had eventually accepted the new laws, because the results were undeniable. The borders were safer, the harvest was more abundant, and the spirit of the people had been revitalized. Nova felt the fated mate bond glowing warmly, within her chest a steady rhythm that matched the beating heart of the city itself. She was no longer a discarded Omega waiting for the world to notice her existence. She was the architect of a new reality. As the afternoon light began to soften, the academy bells rang out a clear and resonant sound that signaled the end of the day's training session. The students began to pack their gear, gathering their wooden swords and leather scrolls with a sense of purpose and camaraderie. Nova felt a sudden surge of gratitude that was so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She reached out and took hold of Kieran's hand, interlacing her fingers with his. He squeezed back firmly, a silent vow of loyalty that stretched far beyond the limitations of their titles. They had navigated the treacherous waters of treason and the cold winds of exile to reach this place of absolute peace. The academy would continue to grow its graduates, spreading the philosophy of the new covenant to every corner of the vast realm. She knew that there would always be challenges ahead, and that the threads of fate would continue to weave unexpected patterns across the world. But for the first time in her life, she did not look into the future with a heavy heart. She looked forward with the calm confidence of a queen who knew exactly where she stood. The silence of the throne room was now replaced by the vibrant hum of life and the laughter of a kingdom that had finally learned how to breathe. Nova rested her head against Kieran's shoulder, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air that swirled around them. Everything they had sacrificed had led to this moment of absolute harmony. The kingdom was no longer a fragile structure held together by fear, but a living, breathing organism, powered by the light of truth and the strength of a shared destiny. She watched the last of the students leaving the courtyard, their footsteps light and purposeful as they walked toward their home. The golden age of the Oracle Queen was not just a title, it was a daily promise to protect the dignity of every single soul under their care. She looked up at the vast expanse of the sky, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought they would face it together as equals, as partners, and as the architects of a world where no voice would ever be silenced again. The sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the western mountains, casting a long warm glow over the sprawling gardens of the capital. Nova sat on a stone bench in the center of the royal gardens, her hands resting comfortably on her lap as she watched the evening light play across the petals of the white flowers. Beside her sat Kieran, his armor long since replaced by simple dark robes of state. He was no longer the imposing warrior king of the past, but a man who had found a deeper strength in the quiet moments of shared purpose. Their kingdom had entered an era of profound transformation, where the rigid walls of old traditions had crumbled to make way for a society built on empathy and foresight. The academy they had established together was now the thriving heart of the realm, a place where the next generation was learning that their differences were the true source of their collective power. Nova looked at the distant spires of the city, knowing that within those walls lives were being saved, and dreams were being built on the foundation of the equality she had fought so hard to establish. The silver light of her oracle power pulsed gently in her mind, a constant reminder of the threads of fate she had helped to reweave. She was no longer an invisible servant, nor was she a frightened exile in a frozen wasteland. She was the architect of a new peace, and the partner of a king who had learned that true leadership was found in the ability to listen. Kieran reached out and took her hand, his touch steady and grounding. He looked at her with a profound sense of gratitude and love that words could never fully capture. They had survived the betrayal of the High Council and the cold reality of the winter storm to emerge into this bright new day. The path ahead was still unfolding, but they would walk it together as equals, as partners, and as the guardians of a future that held no room for the chains of the past. In the distance, the sound of children playing in the academy gardens drifted on the breeze, a sweet, melodic promise of a world where hope was the most valuable currency. Nova closed her eyes and felt the steady rhythm of their intertwined destinies, sensing the infinite possibilities that waited for them in the coming years. She had taken the darkness that was forced upon her and turned it into the very lantern that guided their people. The burden of the oracle was no longer a heavy weight, but a sacred duty that she carried with pride. As the stars began to blink into existence in the darkening sky, she knew that their legacy was just beginning. It was a story written in the language of truth, and courage, a story that would be whispered in the halls of the academy for generations to come. She looked at Kieran and saw the same quiet resolve in his eyes that had defined their journey from the frozen edges of the world to the center of their own shared destiny. The wind rustled through the trees, a soft and comforting sound that spoke of an enduring peace and the promise of a future where no one would ever be forced to hide their true self in the shadows again. The journey of the Oracle Queen was a testament to the fact that even the most fragile light could eventually become the beacon that guided an entire kingdom through the night. As the moon rose to take its place in the celestial dance, Nova stood up and felt the weight of her crown of flowers settle lightly upon her brow. They walked together toward the palace, their steps in perfect unison, reflecting the harmony they had forged against all odds. The kingdom was at peace, and the long shadows of the past had finally been swept away by the morning light of their new reality. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.